Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at a small change I made to the enemy here. If you can see, now when he gets hit, when I attack him, you can see small 10 coming out of the top of his head. And I don't know if you noticed, but the damage display there is always looking at the camera, like all the other banners that we have, so that way the player can always see it. So now that we know how it looks, let's see how it's built. First, let's see the changes to the enemy that we have here. One thing that we added here is that now in the on-damage event, we now have something to do here. We're actually calling the damage message.display damage method here that we're going to be looking into in a second. And then we have this damage message mono behavior here that has a text object prefab that we're instantiating, a couple of variables that we're using, the amount of distance that the text moves, and how long it's moving. And then we also have here a spawn origin from where we are launching this text, which in the case of the enemy here, we are starting at the head, which as you can see here is right here. This is the spawn origin and the text will move from here. So let's look at the code. First, as you may have noticed, the damage that is displayed is always looking at the camera. So we added a little helper here to make sure that that's happening. In fact, if you see here in the damage display prefab, we have a look at behavior here that's currently set to none. So we have here in this look at behavior, pretty similar to what we had before with the UI follow transform, except that instead of moving around, it's just making sure that it's looking at the camera at all times. Here we haven't set up the transform to look at, we simply default to looking at the player. So that's what we're doing here in this check. If we don't have a look at transform at the moment of beginning the mono behavior, then we set that to whatever we find that is of type player. And if we find something there, then we assign it to a transform. And then an update, all that we're looking is calling the look at transform, and as it happens with all the UI elements that we are making look at the camera, because of the orientation of the element itself, we need to rotate it 180 degrees, so it's actually looking at the camera in the right direction. And that's it for the look at helper there. The main thing that we want to look at here is the damage message behavior. Currently we're only using one prefab here, but later we might want to replace this by a pool of prefabs if we want to display several damage messages at the same time. Then as you saw before, we have a reference to the distance that we want to move the text, how long we want to move the text for, and where we want to start the text moving from. Then we have a few helper variables here. We have the actual instance of the TextMesh Pro object that we're using. We have a reference to the coroutine and the lean twin description here that we're going to look in a second. And then we are keeping track of the actual destination for the animation. So let's look into this. If we don't have a spawn origin that's set up, we set up the origin to be the current transform. For the enemy here, this is at the feet of the enemy, so we're not going to use the default transform here. We're actually going to set it up. Then here is where we're using a single transform here. If we later end up using a pool of objects here, then we're not going to set it up this way. But for now, we are instantiating a single TextMesh Pro prefab here that we have set up, as you saw before, this damage display prefab. We're instantiating one of these. And then once we get that instance that is at the spawn origin, although it doesn't really matter because we're going to be changing that. But once we have that instance, then we get a reference to the TextMesh Pro component. And then we set it to active false, that is not showing at the beginning. Then whenever we're calling this display damage, this is what gets called when the enemy gets damaged. Then we are doing three things here. We are first getting a reference to the text object, then we're setting that text, and then we're starting the animation. As I mentioned before, when we're doing this from a pool of objects, then this getText object will give us a text object from the pool. For now, you'll see in a bit, but this is just returning the instance that we set up before. Then we get the damage here that we got from the onHit event or onDamage event, and we're using that to set the text of the object, and then we start a coroutine here to animate it, and we're starting a reference to that coroutine, which will come in handy later. Then we have another helper here for float damage. This is because our damageables are currently generating damage as floats, but we want to use it as an integer because we want to use whole numbers here. So we have a call here to round up the damage to the nearest integer and then using that to display the damage. In the actual animation coroutine, we're getting a reference here to the object. Then we're defining the actual destination of the animation, which is whatever we start from the origin plus however many units we want to move. And here we have made the decision to move it on the y-axis. This is particularly important because it's going to be defined for every call that we make to this kind of damage display. And the way it's set up is always going to move upwards. So once we have the move destination, we use the lean twin library to move the text object here to that destination, which is going to be from the spawn origin, however many units we've defined. So we've defined that here, this is the actual destination for the animation here, and then this is however long we want to run it for. And we store a reference to that twin behavior here, which also will come in handy later. Then we wait for however long the animation is going to last, and after that we're calling here dispose of text object, which for now is simply hiding the text. If we later move on to a pool of objects, for example, this will actually restore it back into the pool. Or if we wanted to actually destroy the object, we could destroy that here, but we are decoupling that behavior for now. As I said before, here in the getTextObject method, we are simply getting a reference to the TextObject instance that we have instantiated from before, but we're doing a little bit of cleanup before we do that. We first figure out if there's any coroutine running for any animation, and if it is, then we stop it. Then we're checking if we have any reference to the lean twin object here, and if we have one and it's actually twinning, which is actually animating here, then we cancel that animation. And once we have that cleanup, then we restore the TextObject instance to the original origin position and origin rotation, and then we set it to active true. Once we've done all this cleanup here, then we return the instance to the object so that we can again set it up for that new animation. And as I mentioned before, here in the dispose of text object, we have a reference to the text object that we are not actually using right now. Later on, once we migrate to using object pools, we will need this reference to be able to return the object to the pool. But for now, we're just setting the game object itself to be active false so that the text becomes invisible. We can hide it once we are done with the animation. So that is it. Let's just look at it in action now that you know how it's built. So here we are again. You can see here the enemy approaching. Now we're using the sword, which does 15 damage, so we should see 15s coming up right there. We turn around, the damage shows the other way around. And unfortunately, since the sword is that much more powerful, the enemy is already dead. But hopefully you can see how this is working. There are still a few other issues to clean up. The current behavior with the enemy is not reacting properly to the hits to get the hit reaction animation. So I'm going to have to clean that up later on. But this will be it for now. We're getting that moving. And this is now finally giving the player a visual cue that they are making damage to the enemy, which was a big issue before. That you could be swinging at the enemy all day long and not know if you're actually making any damage. So yeah, that will be it for today. This was a quick one. I hope that it was useful, and I will see you in the next one when we continue improving the enemy. But I'll see you then. Bye for now.